Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued a stark warning to NATO and the European Union, EU, of a decisive response to any aggression against Russia at the United Nations General Assembly in late September 2025. This statement comes amid escalating tensions along NATO's eastern flank, where NATO countries have reported multiple incursions into their airspace, allegedly by Russian aircraft and drones. Lavrov emphasized that while Russia has no intentions to attack NATO or EU countries, it is prepared to respond firmly to any acts of aggression directed at it. This cautionary message highlights the increasingly fraught state of international relations involving Russia and the Western military alliance, as the conflict in Ukraine continues to exacerbate regional insecurity. Lavrov rejected accusations from Western governments that Russia is planning an assault on NATO and EU countries, labeling these claims as provocations denounced repeatedly by President Vladimir Putin. The tension has notably intensified after Estonia accused Russia of sending fighter jets into its airspace, and after NATO jets intercepted Russian drones in Polish airspace, leading NATO to vow to protect every inch of its territory. In the United States, President Donald Trump expressed support for shooting down Russian planes that violate NATO airspace, a notable shift in rhetoric from earlier portrayals of Russia as a weakened military force. This pledge of strong military vigilance by NATO and the U.S. has further strained relations. Lavrov criticized some NATO and EU politicians for their public remarks about the possibility of a Third World War, calling such rhetoric damaging to efforts aimed at achieving a fair balance of interests among nations. He accused these figures of trying to impose unilateral approaches that undermine international cooperation and peace efforts. Lavrov's address underscored Russia's position as being on the defensive rather than the offensive, insisting Moscow's actions are reactive to perceived threats. He also pointed to repeated proposals made by Russia to NATO capitals for legally binding security guarantees, which have been ignored by the West. The backdrop to these warnings is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has been a major factor behind the deterioration in Russia-West relations. Russia justifies its military actions in Ukraine partly due to NATO's eastward expansion, which it perceives as a direct threat to its national security. The Eastern European region has thus become a flashpoint, with frequent confrontations between NATO forces and Russian military assets, leading to heightened fears of potential direct conflict. Lavrov also condemned Western accusations of Russian involvement in unauthorized drone flights over European countries, and refuted claims linking Russia to disruptions at airports in Denmark. He suggested these incidents might be attempts to test NATO's responses and create a pretext for further Western hostility against Russia. The Russian foreign minister called for respect of UN decisions, pointed out Western double standards on issues such as Palestine and Iran, and highlighted attempts by Western countries to sabotage constructive initiatives at the UN level. In summary, Lavrov's speech was a firm message that any military aggression against Russia will provoke a determined and robust response, underscoring the precarious state of international security in Europe. It reflected Moscow's insistence that it is under threat from NATO's expansion and Western policies, while promising to resist any attempts to undermine its sovereignty or military interests. The stark warnings and heightened military posturing by both Russia and NATO indicate a deepening crisis that carries significant risks for wider international peace and stability. Historical background of Russia-NATO relations. To fully understand the gravity of Lavrov's warning, it is important to consider the history of Russia's interactions with NATO. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia's relationship with NATO was cautiously cooperative. Early in the 1990s, Russia even expressed interest in joining NATO as a means to ensure security and foster stability in Europe. This culminated in the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, which was a significant post-Cold War attempt to build a partnership and prevent escalation by establishing the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council, later replaced by the NATO-Russia Council in 2002. The pact allowed Russia to participate in NATO discussions without having voting rights, fostering dialogue and cooperation on security issues, counterterrorism, and non-proliferation efforts. However, the relationship started to deteriorate in the early 2000s, particularly after the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999, which Russia opposed. The strain worsened following NATO's eastward expansion, which Russia viewed as a direct threat to its sphere of influence and national security. This expansion included the accession of former Eastern Bloc countries and former Soviet republics, including the Baltic states, to NATO membership, which Moscow fiercely opposed. The deterioration deepened with the 2008 Russo-Georgian War and reached a new low in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, prompting NATO to suspend practical cooperation with Russia. Since then, incidents along the NATO-Russia boundary, military buildups, and proxy conflicts in Ukraine and Syria have dramatically heightened tensions. Recent military incidents and escalation. The recent escalation began with reports from NATO member states accusing Russian military jets and drones of violating their airspace. Such incursions are perceived by NATO as provocative and aggressive acts intended to test the alliance's readiness and resolve. Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania have reported multiple airspace breaches over the past months, resulting in NATO scrambling fighter jets to intercept Russian aircraft. In the United States, President Donald Trump publicly called for shooting down Russian planes if they violate NATO airspace, signaling a tougher stance and encouraging more assertive defense postures among NATO members. This rhetoric has been echoed by NATO officials who reaffirm their commitment to defend every inch of alliance territory, invoking Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. In his high-profile UN speech, Sergei Lavrov acknowledged these accusations, but denied that Russia has any intention of launching an offensive against NATO or EU states. Instead, he framed Russia as a nation forced to defend its sovereignty against NATO's aggressive posturing and expansionist policies. Lavrov reiterated Moscow's long-standing demand for legally binding security guarantees that NATO would halt further expansion and reduce military deployment near Russian borders, demands which Western countries have consistently rejected. Geopolitical context and underlying issues. The core of the Russia-Western conflict lies in divergent security perceptions and geopolitical ambitions. Russia views NATO's continued expansion and its military presence near Russia's borders as existential threats. The Kremlin sees Western support to Ukraine as a direct challenge to its influence in the post-Soviet space. From the Western perspective, NATO's open-door policy affirms every sovereign nation's right to choose its security arrangements. The alliance justifies its military presence in Eastern Europe as necessary to deter Russian aggression following Russia's annexation of Crimea and its ongoing involvement in eastern Ukraine. The West accuses Russia of destabilizing European security, violating international law, and undermining the post-World War II rules-based international order. Lavrov highlighted Western double standards, accusing some NATO and EU leaders of irresponsibly speaking about the risk of a Third World War, which he said aggravated tensions unnecessarily. He admonished the West for ignoring Russia's proposals for dialogue and security cooperation, portraying Moscow as ready and willing to contribute to global peace but forced to respond decisively to Western provocations. The role of the United Nations and international diplomacy. Lavrov's speech at the UN also underscored Russia's appeal for multilateralism and adherence to UN principles, criticizing what Moscow sees as unipolar Western dominance and interference in sovereign affairs. He contrasted Russia's calls for dialogue and negotiation with what he described as Western attempts to isolate and sanction Russia, particularly in reference to the ongoing Ukraine conflict. While the UN remains a forum for dialogue, the stark warnings from Moscow signal that diplomatic solutions are becoming increasingly fraught. The international community is closely watching developments, wary of the potential for miscalculation that could trigger military confrontations with widespread consequences. Potential consequences and international impact. Lavrov's warning signals heightened risks of escalation. If a military incident along NATO's borders were interpreted as aggression, it could quickly escalate under NATO's collective defense commitments, potentially leading to broader confrontation. The tensions affect global energy markets, international trade, and diplomatic relations beyond Europe. Countries around the world are concerned about the stability of the European continent, given its strategic significance and interconnected economies. Moreover, the crisis triggers concerns about nuclear deterrence and arms control regimes, which have been weakened over the recent years. In summary, Sergei Lavrov's warning exemplifies the deep and dangerous divide between Russia and the West. It is a reflection of an international security landscape marked by mistrust, competing ambitions, and unresolved conflicts, especially regarding Ukraine. While no side desires open war, the rhetoric and military posturing increase the risks of accidental escalation and prolonged instability in Europe and beyond.